Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Dynamic Decisions, the podcast where we explore strategies that drive decision making in the world of business. I'm your host, Keisha Cable, and I'm the CEO of C Model Data. And today we have a special guest who's a true leader in digital product management. His name is John. John is the Chief Business Officer at InterSources, which is a trusted partner in cloud security, cybersecurity, PLG consulting, digital transformation, and professional services. John has over 15 years of experience in mid-sized companies and startups and has a wealth of knowledge in delivering innovative and scalable services that not only satisfy customers, but also empower his team. John, we want to welcome you to this show. I am so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let's not waste any time. Let's dive right in. With your extensive background in digital product leadership, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you believe is the most critical element for organizations to succeed in the digital product space today?
I think it really maps into two things. One is vision and bringing that vision in consistency across the organization and having that obviously aligned to the customer. But and then second is knowing that the team knows where and how they fit into the puzzle so that they understand what they're building and the value that they bring in that product.
Okay, I want to stay here for a little bit. So you just said two things. Can you go a little bit deeper on and give us some of your insights about the importance of aligning product strategies with customer needs? What type of decisions do you find yourself kind of thinking about that directly impact the things that you're going to build and really mapping out the entire customer experience?
So the most important areas is hearing the voice of the customer. That has always been a challenge, and everybody loves to use that mantra, but really hearing it and working on it begins to evolve the product. Usually the first one or two iterations of the product is the startup founder's ideas or the internal team's ideas, but then it bounces into and for it to succeed, it has to start aligning to what the customers want. And that can be simplicity, ease of use, intuitiveness, meeting all my needs as a customer of that product or of that need versus, only doing parts of it. And so part of that expectation is to connect that into the organization so that they understand that this is not really about them and this is now about the customer and making sure that the completeness happens. This happened in a company that I'm an advisor on, and they and typical startup fashion, they do a pivot, but that pivot has resulted in creating a far more extensive product and far more intuitive than its competitors, and they are beginning to take off. So very interesting. I'm sorry, not very interesting, but very much in line with what we're trying to point out, which is voice of the customer is very critical.
So tell me a little bit about how the voice of the customer plays when you're and let's I want you to focus in on the frameworks that you kind of use for decision making here. How do you leverage the voice of the customer when you're making high stakes decisions and when you don't have all of the information you need, but the voice of the customer is a part of the information you have? Tell me a little bit about frameworks you might use and how you might advise some of your startup.
Sure. So we do like 80-20 rules, long tent, the long pole in the tent concept. There's also the typical, how many of these requests are coming in from customers so that those create the balances and give the direction. And really from there, you've got to have trust in yourself, trust in the team that you're heading in the right direction. Now that and you have to think of it as iterative. So that iteration is I may only get 15% in, I'm sorry, I may only get 80% in that direction, but that's better than waffling and not going anywhere. Making those steps doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It just means that you're heading in a direction and then course correcting becomes available to you. So the typical handful of approaches that we all know that I just described gives the ability to make that step. Can be 1, 2 steps, and then the course correction really begins to tune it. You can think of it as sort of like sailing, even, where you kind of aim in a direction, you may be off, and you aim again, you narrow it down, and eventually you're still getting to, your target, but those course corrections are what really get you there.
How hard is it to get the teams that you work with to understand this? Is this one of those things that's complex, or is this something that usually you can explain it in this way, people get it and you keep it moving? Does this require like a mindset shift, or is this easy to do?
This has been easy to do for me. So when I hear that the challenges like that, I don't know I don't have the experience in the background in those arenas. It is intuitive for me. It is part of the background that I have always had. I think that background comes from mentoring individuals. It comes from leading teams. And as a result, you just kind of find a very specific path to get people to understand, to look a certain direction, understand what their value is in that puzzle. And when you get that, you get buy-in. So as a result of that, you begin to find that course correcting is easy. There is one hurdle that is potential, and I have always worked to weed it out of my organization, which is there are high performers that have low trust, and they tend to become kind of toxic. We always think of we want high performers and high trust. So I trust the people around me. We want that, but we also want that high performer. Getting that, we think of that as maybe the alpha, the A's, but a lot of times the alphas can be they're just high performers, and then they're screaming, and we don't want that. I would much rather take a slightly slower ship, get the work done, and have a cohesive team that wants to work together, that wants to strive for the same goal. And that has been just sort of the background, and how it's just been nurtured in me, and how I think my teams have always been.
This is so critical. I want to add one layer in. So now imagine I've got high performers, low trust, and
Mhm.
I want to be able to move them out of the low trust area. Do I try or do I not try? What do I do in that circumstance?
So you obviously try. You want to keep as many people as possible because you can keep that consistency. Consistency in the organization helps with the inertia and keeps it moving. But if you're dropping people in and out frequently, then that causes a disruption. And so in essence, it's like a bus starting and stopping versus sort of just smoothly going. But once it's clear that it isn't going to work, you have to make the decision. And what also many people have challenges with this, many managers, is they wait for excuses, external factors, to drive that decision, and then they don't take ownership of that decision. So I have seen over the years, the economy has slowed down, so we need to let these people go. We can't afford them on there. They don't necessarily cite that they're challenging people, or you've done something so egregious that I've got to now do something, rather than taking the ownership and recognizing that if we can do these quickly, there's very likely a place that that person would rather work and be more happy than they are at our firm. And at the same time, I can find people that can take over, that are also happy and are compatible with the organization, but are also contributing in a way that makes the overall firm work together.
This is so good. I know we kind of deviated into this space around the people, but I do believe that when we think about decision making, these are some of the hardest ones to make, the ones that are relative to people and the human experience, right?
Mhm,
I've
mhm.
been in a position and I hadn't really, so I really thank you for the clarity around high performance, low trust, because I've been in that position where you think about, man, I've got these folks are doing a great job, but they are definitely making it harder to produce an aligned team, right? So I really love that you bring that out and it becomes one of the hardest decisions to actually make. So let's talk a little bit, switch gears a little bit and go back to thinking about decisions and outcomes. How do you actually track the outcomes of your major decisions? And if it's helpful to you, you can talk about this through the lens of like product related initiatives, because that's where the core of your expertise, your current work is anyway. And so, maybe what are some of the metrics that you find most telling?
Interestingly, it's just very simply KPIs. It roots back to in college. I was sort of as you were describing the question, I was remembering a college professor, and he says, "What do you want to be? What do you want when you graduate after 10 years or so?" And many people said, "I want to be a millionaire." And then some people said, "Well, I want to do A, B, C, D and get to it." And so those who are in that long distance, everything's vapor in the middle, that I want to be a millionaire, have the greatest of challenges. They have the greatest of aspirations, but it's about how you get there. And what that translates to in business is the KPIs. What are the intermediary steps that they look like?
Yeah.
And how do I measure that it is what it is? And then at the end, what is the goals? Obviously, the revenue, obviously the operational efficiencies, obviously the sales, and all those things happen. And that can be a little bit less tangible. Those are sort of like the icing on the cake, but the core KPIs, this is what we accomplished. This is how we accomplished it. This is what we spent. This is the problems we solved. Those are the ones that actually give you the insight that you're headed in the right direction.
Now you know you are speaking my language right now, right? Are you trying to butter me up for something because you are
That was
talking?
the cake stuff, right?
That was it. You are buttering it up. Okay, so with that said, let's talk a little bit. Let's go a little further and talk about so let's say you've got KPIs, you've been managing them for a while, data's been coming in, the organization is flowing and humming, and someone is now going to leave the company. How do you actually ensure that institutional knowledge is preserved, especially in the areas where it requires people to have vast expertise? How do you do that in that situation? And I use KPIs because usually you master the analysis of KPIs, right? You start to know what good and bad look like. How do you master keep that institutional knowledge preserved?
Well, interestingly, I was in my career going up, I was the expert and I was the expert leaving. So I was the institutional knowledge. And since I grew up in the mindset of I work here because you want me to work here versus I work here because I choose, that implication was that I was happy to share that information. And so when I as a manager, you begin to realize that the most important thing is I'm sorry, one of the important things in product building is that you need documentation. You need to create transfer of that knowledge across multiple people. And so having been through that in the early part of my career, that is always one of the buttons that is sensitive to make sure that happens. And I've also and what we also have to recognize is that as we're moving up the food chain in our career, the executives don't necessarily have that mindset. And I've been in places where documentation is the least important thing and it drops off the task list. But in products, it becomes one of the most important things to do because you can't do version 2. You can't do version 3. I'll just throw this little tidbit out there. It's I think it's kind of a small story, but it is a story that is not maybe well known. When the banks began to move into 24/7 landscapes, the old systems were based on batching. So in other words, it would run and be done and be quiet, run and done, be quiet. And so they could run at night, and then when during the day, then people went and did their transactions, it would do it, and then at night, it would process everything.
Mhm.
On a 24/7 scale, that couldn't work. So the IT departments went back in to try and correct this stuff, and the
Mhm.
only solution they could come up with was to make faster and faster computers to put it onto faster and faster computers because nobody actually knew what was going on underneath in the code, and they were terrified to actually make any code changes to deal with the 24/7. So they had to come up so what they did was to hide that situation. So it's a anecdotal story that actually shows up every once in a while in conversation.
Amazing. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the story. Stories are the best. We love a good story here, but what a
I have a
great
lot.
point to make. Tell me a little bit more about when you think about how you make decisions today, the core decisions, the most important ones. What's at the top? of the list for you of the top of things that you actually consider. And this is leading into our next little exercise where I'm going to actually ask you some questions
Mhm.
to figure out what percentage of type of decision maker are you before we get into the last parts of the segment. But I'd love to just kind of in plain language know from you like what's in the formula.
So getting the team tuned is critical. And why I say that is that because they are the ones typically touching the actual details underneath. And that can be whether it is the IT engineers or the product makers from one side to the salespeople on the other side. And what the training is that I don't want you to come and just simply ask me, help me and solve this problem. Is come in and tell me, describe to me the problem, describe to me two or three alternatives, and describe to me the implications of those alternatives, whether they be financial, technical, overhead, I need more resources. And then tell me your recommendation from those three. And I prefer to hear that as the conversation because then with that, then that can be brought in with multiple groups and then what you get is again typically roots back to the long pole in the tent, the iterative process. And so the decisions become, though may be a little more challenging, you just got to go with your gut and do it. So depending upon kind of where the challenge is, the obstacle is, you can take one of those approaches of we're either going to go all in and make this change, or we're going to take some baby footsteps, but at least we're making some moves forward so we can test the waters. In other words, I was just going to say, just to anecdotally again, we see this very commonly, and we know this as A/B testing on people do in cold emails, people do on websites to see which one works because they don't really know quite the answer. That's iterative in nature.
It is, and based on assumptions, right? So we start with what we're assuming, and then we prove or disprove all along the way, which is, I think, if more people understood that and were okay with that, we could probably move faster in a number of areas in the
Yeah,
work that we're doing.
there
Yeah.
there
So
is
yeah,
one other piece that I wanted to bring in, which was I'm also a real follower of Dr. Deming and his continuous improvements. So in that light, as the inertia is moving, that becomes a bit, that's where the big challenges are that you're talking about. But as the improvements occur, it's like, we're describing the sailing. Everything begins to narrow because you're constantly improving. After a while, the adjustments are not quite as scary. The things I don't know are fewer and fewer. The alternatives, recommendations become tighter and tighter.
that's right. That is the goal. That we believe that this is not just a theory, right? We've seen this in practice over the course of many, many years, and that this is absolutely right.
Yes. So the Dr. Deming, you may or may not know, is somebody from post World War II, was not particularly liked in the United States for his idea of continuous improvement, because here in the United States, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, was the motto in the 60s and 70s. And so he left and went to Japan. And so he is the father of the car manufacturers, the manufacturing process. Many of the ideologies that they use is from him. And then he came back in the he's and was accepted in and was considered back into the car industry. And so a lot of the manufacturing processes that they employ is a result of him.
Isn't that a nugget? Thank you so much for that one. I really appreciate it. All right, audience. Well, I hope that you guys are enjoying this, enjoying learning and getting some tidbits here. Let's take another little step forward and let's figure out your decision making persona. So, the way that we do this is I will ask you a series of questions that reflect different decision making personas, and they're all kind of related to how you might ask them in your role about strategy. And for each one of them, you're going to share how much that persona resonates with you on a scale from 0 to 100. Now, you
Sure.
only get 100%. There's four personas, and you get 100% makes up all of you, right? So let's go through and you'll assign a percentage, but you can't go over 100 and you're going to rate each one from 0 to 100. Make sense? Okay. So here's the first one. When you consider a new product feature, how do you ensure it aligns with our core values and strengthens our customer relationships? That's the question. That's called a feeler type persona question. How much do you resonate with the way a feeler would ask a question? Very low. Like what percent?
If 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 10 to 15%, that would be a lot.
Okay, so let's go 10% feeler. All right.
Yes, and it's a known weakness of mine, actually.
Okay, this is interesting. This is good. Let's look at the next one. Reflecting on last year's product launches, what specific trends or insights have you uncovered that can significantly influence our next development cycle? How much of that? That one's called a planner. How much of that persona do you resonate with? You've got 90% you're working with.
Well, let's say, this one varies, but let's say 30%, and then this may go up and down because I see it as you describe it as planner, but I see it as analytical.
Okay, hold that thought. Here's the next one. In evaluating our previous product initiatives, what key lessons have we learned that have fundamentally changed our decision making process? That one is called a counter.
I would be, I think that's, I don't know, 50%.
Okay.
We might have to adjust, but that one's probably gonna be up there.
Okay, let's go to the last one. As you formulate your new product strategies, what specific data points do you rely on that validate these decisions? That one's called a data driver.
So that actually is actually pretty low,
That's pretty
interestingly.
low.
That could
Okay.
be like a 5 or 10, and I'll actually explain why. In troubleshooting, that is 90% because the data is actually driving the direction.
That's good.
But from a product perspective, I'm not solving a problem necessarily. I'm trying to be more actually, it is more emotional. It is more emotional and intuitive of how is this alignment occurring? So to me, the data-driven part of is really a little bit less because I'm sorry, the data driven that you're describing is very low. What I see is really the previous two to be much stronger because those are the data points that are aligning to the customer.
This is good. So you are 10% feeler, 30% planner, 50% counter, and 10% data driven. Here's the
Does that
best
make 100?
that makes 100. That's it.
Okay.
That's a hundred
Okay.
percent. That's you. Now it's all about as we go down the path becoming a balanced decision maker, right? So there's no right or wrong to any of this. It's just really interesting to see how we lean into decisions and then eventually communicate that to our teams and kind of work through how do you get to the most balanced perspective in your decision making. So this is really great stuff. Listen, this has been incredible. I thank you so much for your time. I have one final question for you, and is if you could give one piece of advice to aspiring product leaders in your industry, one
Mhm.
and make it decision specific, things that are or decision forward. What would that piece of advice be?
That would be decision forward. Well, I was going to say, to me, on the product is communication, a vision. It is, I actually wrote this down. Communication, a vision, make sure your leadership is on completely on the same page, whether how they communicate, how they manage, and how they see tech fitting into the products, into how the product will be delivered. And then make sure they understand the vision and then how the employee or the team fits into that vision. What are they bringing to the table that makes them so valuable?
This is awesome. Thank you so much again. Your expertise in this particular space has been so helpful. Product leadership is very important in tech companies. It's inspiring to know that you've spent as much time as you have really digging in and not just thinking about the product itself, but the people who you need to help you bring products to life. And we thank you to our listeners for tuning in. And remember, the best decisions come from great conversations. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, rate it, share it with your network, and let's keep conversing and talking and making sure that dynamic decisions are the types of decisions that we're making every day. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, John, for being here with me. John, would you let everyone know how they can learn more about you, more about Inner Sources, more about the work that you're into?
You can find our company, intersourcesinc.com, on the internet, and I'm John Papazian at LinkedIn, and easy to find, Chief Business Officer. Just look those two up.
Awesome. Thank you so much.